Hello, once again, our fellow Americans, South Carolinians, as citizens of the planet, and welcome once again to the Leo and Larry Show. I'm Leo Woodbury, and my co host here is.
Larry Smith.
And we're so glad to have you once again tuning in. Thank you for your many comments and all the encouraging things you say about this show, but it's only as good as it is because of you. And so today we have an awesome guest. And I have to say, like some folks say, full transparency, this is a good friend of mine. I'm talking about none other than Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. And Mustafa is currently with the National Wildlife Federation. He's the senior vice president, but is currently acting as the president. And so, welcome, Dr. Ali. I might as well do how we do all the time. How you doing, Mustafa? And thanks for coming on.
Well, I'm blessed. Thank you all so much for having me. It's an honor to be able to hold space with you. Really appreciate all the work that everyone does to make justice become a reality for our people. So I really appreciate y'all having me with you.
Thank you so much. We want folks to know who you are, what you've been involved in. It's so many things. And I mean, you're known all over the world, all over this country. And like myself, and Larry, we became activists in our teen years. So why don't you kind of take folks from where you started up to where you are today?
Oh,
And you
sure.
can't tell everything because the show's not that long. All right.
No, I'll keep it real brief.
And your wife is listening.
I'll be very brief. I was real blessed that I was raised in a family of folks who are focused on workers' rights and civil rights. Come out of a union family. I grew up primarily in Appalachia and in Michigan. So I got both the rural flavor and I also got the urban flavor, and started working on social justice issues when I was 16 years old, taking the lessons that I'd learned from my grandfather, who of course worked in the coal mines, and my father, who worked in factories and was an engineer, about, how do you authentically engage with folks? How do you make sure that the voices of communities are being moved forward, so that we can work to do the things that we need to do to make sure that justice becomes a reality: economic justice, housing justice, transportation justice, of course, health justice and environmental justice, all those things coming together. And was just blessed that there were a number of civil rights leaders and early environmental justice leaders who saw something in me and embraced me and taught me and mentored me, corrected me, but uplifted me. So I just bring forward all those lessons that I've learned over the years, and try and do what I can to be helpful. Spent 24 years in federal service, 22 years at EPA, 2 years on Capitol Hill, where I was blessed to work for Chairman John Conyers, who was chairman of the Judiciary Committee at that time. A couple of years at the Hip Hop Caucus, where I got an opportunity to sort of learn on a deeper level the power that exists inside of culture, that exists inside of music, that exists inside of the arts, and how that could help us to make sure that we had voting justice, and getting more people engaged in that space. And then, of course, working on environmental issues all along the way. And as you said, now I'm also over at the National Wildlife Federation. And of course, Rev, I also founded my own company, Revitalization Strategies, which I'm the CEO and founder of. So just doing what I can to be in space with folks and honor the lessons and to do the work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So tell folks about, because folks talk about how environmental justice is now the flavor. I can't even say flavor of the month. It's like the flavor of years now. But your time at EPA, and tell folks about the Office of Environmental Justice and how that came about, and your contribution.
Well, the Office of Environmental Justice, which was actually named the Office of Environmental Equity, was founded in November of 1992. But that's not where the story begins. It actually came out of a set of recommendations from frontline leaders in the late 80s, in the early 90s, the Michigan Working Group, and folks who were at the first People of Color Summit in 1991, and all those amazing people who dedicated their time and resources, saying that we had to have a central place inside of the US government where folks could come, where they could bring their issues, where they could also begin to have a seat at the table and helping to frame out policy that was so necessary. And that we also needed to begin to find ways of funding the work that needed to happen. So, that's how the office came to be. But you go back a little bit further, Hazel Johnson there on the south side of Chicago and Altgeld Gardens in that toxic donut and the work that she was doing also played a critical role. Most folks don't know that, when a young man by the name of Barack Obama moved to Chicago, it was Hazel Johnson, the mother of the environmental justice movement, who actually, validated who he was and told folks, let's give him a chance. And he began to do his community organizing there. She also embraced me when I was a very young student and used to call me the kid. And I'd be in those hotel lobbies there with the leaders listening and learning as they were strategizing on the things that they needed to do and how they were going to engage with EPA and other entities. There's all this work that happened before by so many amazing folks that created the moment for the Office of Environmental Equity, which became the Office of Environmental Justice, even to come into being. And I was just blessed that I was a student at that time, and that Dr. Clarice Gaylord, who was the first director of the Office of Environmental Justice, gave a whole bunch of us, it was just a little tiny group of folks, the responsibility for helping to frame out all this work that we now see beginning to blossom, the beginnings. So I was just, fortunate. I believe in divine, not divine, just divine intervention, but sort of a divine commitment and a divine also set of expectations that brought me into that moment.
And environmental justice now, and you mentioned, some folks are saying now that we need another People of Color Summit like we had in 1991. But why don't you talk, I want folks to realize, like, not only how big this thing has become over the years, but also what kind of resources are available. So can you talk a little bit about, the funding that's out there right now with Justice 40, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and how many millions and millions of dollars there are that are available for community-based organizations and local government?
Yeah, well, let me put it in perspective for folks, because we often jump into this moment and don't talk enough about where we came from. In the early days, even folks who worked in EPA and other federal agencies, they didn't want to hear anything about environmental justice. They said that it wasn't real, that people were probably making it up. And the budget for the first Office of Environmental Equity was about $3 million for the entire country. And that included salaries and everything else. After hard work by so many, folks on the front lines and folks in agencies and folks, coming from lots of different spaces and places, we now find ourselves in a moment where not only does everyone know that environmental justice is real, the science is there now, the studies are there, validating things that communities had shared for decades upon decades. And now we find ourselves in a moment where we have a president who, for the first time ever, has put out a number of executive orders, way beyond what President Clinton did when he signed Executive Order 12898 back in 1994. But there were no resources that were tied to that. Now in this moment, we have, close to $1 trillion that's out there for folks, coming from, as you mentioned, both the Inflation Reduction Act and both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the CHIPS Act. So when you add those three together, you're starting, to be in that $1 trillion range. Now, just because there's $1 trillion out there does not mean that it is going to make it to our communities. How do we help to make that become a reality? In this administration, there's also something called Justice 40, which means 40% of the benefits are supposed to go to our most vulnerable communities. You notice I said benefits and did not say dollars.
Mhm.
I wish that it had said that. But there are a number of dollars that are tied to making those benefits become real. And there's a tool that folks use, which is a GIS mapping tool. It's a climate and environmental justice screening tool, which when you plug in your zip code or your lat longs, then it starts to light up where our most vulnerable communities are. And those resources are supposed to go into those spaces. But we have to, as my grandmother says, you have power unless you give it away. We have to utilize our power and actually get engaged in these various grants and cooperative agreements and contracting opportunities that are out there. Because if we don't, those resources will end up going to others who may not necessarily need them as much as our communities do. So there's a huge amount of resources, but you got to be able to build the capacity for people to be able to, fully sort of, interact with those sets of opportunities. And that's an area that, for some of our smaller nonprofits, that there has never been the resources to help them build their infrastructure to be able to operate on a high level. Because I know Rev, you, and I'm sure Mr. Smith as well, are not interested in the crumbs from the table.
No.
As our dear brother, El Haj Malik Shabazz once shared with us, better known as Malcolm X. It is about us finally being able to address the wealth gap that exists inside of our country, because these are not dollars that people are just giving our communities. These are tax dollars. That means that Black and brown and indigenous communities who have been working for years upon years upon years and not receiving much back from those tax dollars they're paying, that this is a moment for us to actually access those. So that's why, one, I get excited, but I'm also cautiously optimistic because I understand the work that is necessary to make sure that a significant percentage of these resources actually make it to the spaces and places that need them the most.
Let me ask you this, Mustafa. Just quick tie to it, Larry. I'm sorry, I'll let you jump in. So, talking about problems, two things. Both of us travel across the country. One, the need for community groups to partner together and collaborate.
Yeah.
They're not going to get we have to get out of this thing thinking, I'm going to get the organization, get money from my organization. You have to work with people. And if you don't know, learn from those that do. And my other question for you is, what's going on with our local governments? They either don't know about these resources, or I've had conversations with some who they're just trying to figure out how to use the money for downtown revitalization and those sorts of things, and don't realize this is an opportunity to lift up communities that are struggling. And what's your take? Because I know you're running into that too.
Yeah, it's amazing. So one, let me hit the first point that you mentioned. We have to have authentic collaborative partnerships. They have to exist. And that means that you got to build real relationships with folks. That means that we've got to address the power dynamics that often exist and break those down to make sure that that folks know that they're going to be equal partners in the process, if you will. As I travel, whether from Alaska to Puerto Rico and everywhere across the 48, and I asked the question, how many people know about Justice 40? How many people know about, the bipartisan infrastructure or the Inflation Reduction Act? Very few people know about it. So that means that those in government who might be looking at some of these resources and may not have the best intentions for our communities, they have a leg up, if you will. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen. That these resources exist, one. Two, how do you access them? Three, how do you build partnerships and coalitions that make you a stronger and more viable candidate for the resources? And then, of course, how do we make sure that the capacity is there so that once folks get the resources, that they're able to accomplish the goals that they've set out for themselves? And the last part there, is a lot of work that needs to happen along with that first part of just letting people know that they exist. I think many people know what they want their communities to look like, right? So then it's just a matter of helping people to understand, well, here's this set of resources at the Department of Transportation, and here's this set of resources that are now at Housing and Urban Development. Here's this pot of money that's over here at EPA, and here's this foundation that says that they want to help support people to be able to be successful and to build sort of these sustainable sets of resources so that people can continue to grow their organization, move their organization from a $100,000 a year organization or a $250,000 a year organization to a strong $4, $5, $6 million organization, so that we're building real power inside of our communities. And we have that opportunity. But as you said, there have been folks who have actually traveled these roads, who've learned lessons many times, through trial and tribulation, who have a lot to contribute, so that newer sets of folks who maybe are now entering into this financial space don't have to, make the same mistakes, or they don't have to, how they used to say it, bump your knee, that type of thing. So we've got some real opportunities, but that means we got to trust each other. And that means that we have to come together in community to be able to be competitive for the resources that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
So the question, I guess, is there's a strong, very strong conservative effort to stop the flow of these resources going into communities of color. And in states like South Carolina, where the conservatives have a supermajority, that money is going to have challenges trickling down to the grassroots level. Is your solution to basically say, let's form coalitions and try to supersede those things?
I mean, I think that's a part of it, but we have to deal with the reality of the things that you just highlighted. So there can be some pressure placed on them to actually begin to do the right thing, but we know that can take a huge amount of energy and time. We also know that this administration is trying to get a significant portion of these resources out the door in the next 14 months. So that means that there's a lot moving. We also know that many of the vehicles that are being used to move these dollars have their own sets of restrictions, I might say, or hurdles that people have to be able to navigate. So we've got these dynamics that are going on, and that's where some of the foundations who are out there who are helping to fund solutions to be able to get to some of these dollars is important. That's why there are folks out there like Harold Mitchell from Spartanburg, South Carolina, who's been getting these EJ40 sort of executive documents there, so that both folks on the city level, the county level, and the state level can better lock in some of these resources. So it's Reverend Smith, it can get tricky in certain states that have never been interested in funding our communities. We saw what happened with the Black farmers when we finally got resources moving in their direction, and how people had these legal cases. And the interesting thing is that you've got some dollars that go straight into state governments. Governors are making decisions. They're putting commissions together. There are other dollars that can go to the city level or can go straight to community organizations. So there is a mix of those. And for the ones that are going to the state, that's where we got to start looking at certain laws and actions that we have, like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which says that you can't utilize federal funds to discriminate. So if folks are not utilizing the dollars properly, we've got some leverage that's there. Hopefully we can find a moment where folks who've never cared about our communities will also say, but you know what? These dollars can also go to lower wealth white communities who are also being impacted. And maybe that will be enough of impetus that they will do the right thing. But I'm not going to put all my hopes and wishes in that particular bucket.
What do you do at this stage of the game when the conservatives in Washington especially are trying to tie the resources of the programs that you're talking about, especially unspent money in those programs, to the debt ceiling? And they're wanting to go back and take money out of those programs, basically to make sure that they're tying it to the debt ceiling so they can lower the debt for the United States. And we know in our community that that's rhetoric. That's not serious. That's just, as some brother might say, pretty talk. But at the end of the day, what happens if they're successful in that process?
Well, it's an excellent question. So what we see playing out right now is with COVID dollars that were still out there. That's what they've been focusing on in relationship to what you just shared. Why people are trying to get these dollars committed in the next 14 months is because even though they're committed in the next 14 months, some of the programs, the dollars that go out will last 5 years all the way up to 7 years. So that means that that cycle will be protected. The other part, of course, that I know you all talk about is that we got to make sure that we're also getting people engaged in the civic process and that we are electing individuals who actually care about what's going on. So some of this stuff is going to go to the courts for some of the stuff that they've been trying to block. And depending on which courts it lands in, will determine how some of it will play out. So it is a multiple set of actions that we have to do to try and address some of the ththings that we see going on.
Long as it don't land in the district in Texas.
Well, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We're okay, because the Texas district passes everything conservative.
This is true. This is true.
Yeah. I was gonna say the other thing is with people of color, and I have to speak to my experience and the experience of my family and ancestors, that community folks, we're really good at taking a little bit and maximizing it, maximizing the benefits that come out of that, and realizing that we have to, this money is not just a handout that needs to be repeated over and over again, but we also need to use these resources to build businesses, for workforce development, to create jobs, so that we're creating additional revenue streams that go along with what's being put out now. And my biggest concern and fear, while I'm elated and excited about the fact that this has never happened in American history before, it's almost the equivalent of, let's give them 40 acres and a mule. This never happened before. But my concern is that we missed this opportunity in a really big way. And then when the next budgeting cycle comes around, they say, hey, we tried to give them money. We tried to help them. We got all these unspent dollars, so let's not do that again. So I think it's really important that all of these dollars, I think I'm correct, Mustafa, in saying it's probably billions of dollars, if not millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that they're pushing out in the next 14 months, that we really focus on what we can do and just gather what we can.
But I think the challenge for us in the media business, especially in the African-American media business, is we consistently don't get the opportunity to share these messages with our community. And when we do get the opportunity, it's through a news release. It's just through a PSA. And we're businesses. And we need the resources to manage and to grow our businesses just like everybody else. And so the challenge becomes, a large part of the growth and survival of African-American media during the pandemic was the investment the federal government made in getting the message out, including African-American media. Because, and they've slowed almost to a trickle, if not stopped that process now. And the reality of it is that there are people in our community who are thinking they can breathe easy because they're thinking that the problem has gone away, that the challenges are gone away. And unless we are talking to our community, a classic example, one of the most detrimental situations to the African-American community is HIV/AIDS, right? Do you realize that the federal government advertises nowhere in African-American owned media and print media in the country? That makes no sense.
Mm.
Well, I agree with you. You know, we can talk about these big sets of numbers of resources that are out there, but if we're not also helping to strengthen and build our media, which plays a critical role in helping to reach folks, then we're going to miss the mark. I know that, you know, Roland Martin and myself and others have been having serious conversations with these federal agencies about the budgets that they utilize around getting messaging out, and how a teeny tiny percentage of that actually makes it to Black media, especially Black-owned media, Black-owned newspapers. So, you know, we're pushing on that along with lots of others. So hopefully that will finally get some traction and we'll be able to do that. But
we've established that the African American, that the federal government advertising in America.
Can you repeat that?
It's not a lack of resources. The largest advertiser in America is the federal government, not McDonald's, not Burger King, not Google, not Facebook, but the federal government. But we've sat down in many capacities, or including with President Biden himself, and have not been able to get the relationships built in the way that we need to be. You know, we get less than 0.1% of the advertising from the federal government on an annual basis. Now, Roland Martin will take the same thing. The challenge basically is it has to come from a desire to do this. It has to come from not just saying, you know, that's a good idea. No, how do I implement this idea? How do we include African-American media? I think one of the problems we have with African-American media, and I'll let you get to the next point, is that we are a media of inconvenience. We tell stories that sometimes people don't want to hear. But to leave you on that, the bottom line is that when you talk about Roland Martin and the National African American Media Group trying to make inroads into African American community, I have a 40-year relationship with my community, and I'm first generation. I'm just bringing on my second generation. I had a publisher just called me earlier today from Chicago, as a matter of fact, Joyce LaBelle. I'm going to leave north. They called me from Chicago today. She's second generation in Chicago. She's 90 years old. So we have a working and ongoing relationship with our community. How do we build that into the resources that we need?
Well, Larry, you know, you said something once that resonated strongly with me, and I might have mentioned it to you, Mustafa. But you made the point, we were talking about educating people around climate change and how Blacks and other people of color, how because of redlining and banks and segregation, discriminatory practices, how we live in flood zones and low-lying areas and places that get hit the hardest by tornadoes and hurricanes and flooding. And you made an excellent point, and this might be a good talking point, Mustafa, as we talk with the federal government. Who do we think reads those people of color newspapers? Who do we think reads El Diario and La Prensa, the Spanish-speaking newspapers? It's the people most impacted that environmental justice and these executive orders are supposed to be helping. So one great point is that, Larry, you're not going to reach masses of people who need to be educated, who need to get resources if you're not advertising and getting your message into the papers that they read.
Well, here's the bottom line on that, Mustafa. The point basically is African-American media, the African-American press, celebrates 196 years this year without the participation of the federal government in any major way, without the participation of state and local governments in any major way. What does that tell you about our capacity to grow, our capacity to survive, our capacity to build? You don't do that because it takes money to print a newspaper every week. It takes money to distribute a newspaper. It takes money to edit and write a newspaper. So you're not going to be out there spending thousands of dollars a week unless you have some people who are committed to reading and being involved in your newspaper. And I think, I've talked to President Biden on this issue. I've interviewed him personally on this issue a couple of times myself. And I can tell you that he has a great point of rhetoric on it. And before he won Charleston, when he came, the weekend before he won Charleston, I got a call from Ben Chavis, who's president, national chairman of NNPA, and he said, this was on a Saturday, and he said, you need to be in Charleston on Tuesday morning. We were there, African-American publishers from across the country and across the region were there for a roundtable discussion that was live streamed with Vice President Biden at that particular point. And we had that conversation. And President Biden said to us, I'd like to spend a bunch of money with all your newspapers, even during this campaign in Charleston. He said, but I don't have money at this particular point. Now he does. He's the president of the United States. Now he has access to those dollars. What is the holdback? What is the challenge of him investing in our community? We live in a diverse America, and until we acknowledge that all of us don't have the same opinions about anything, then we're not going to move forward as a community. And being the third rock from the sun, all of us on the same rock.
I agree. There has to be accountability. We showed up, we gave our vote, and there is a responsibility that is tied to supporting those who have supported you. So, through some of his executive order stuff, they've been focusing on contracting and subcontracting, but we have to make that become a reality for our organizations. And that means that, unfortunately, we got to continue to put the pressure on and the spotlight where the disparities still exist to make it become a reality. The other part of it is that in his administration, of course, he has all the secretaries and administrators of these agencies and departments. They all have significant budgets that they also should be making sure that they are supporting Black media and brown media. So it's not like that the dollars don't exist. It is about a prioritization of where you want those dollars to actually land. And do you truly want to strengthen those organizations? Because as their voice is strengthened and grows, that means that spotlight or magnifying is also going to continue to be enhanced. And that is a level of accountability. That means that you better be doing even better. So I think that there are all these different dynamics that are a part of it, but it comes down to one, the resources do exist, but it's about prioritization.
I agree.
Right, absolutely. Can you catch us up with Palatine, where they had that, where they had the train derail?
Yep.
And these toxic chemicals, and that was really in the news for a while. Now we're not hearing very much. I know your ear is to the ground.
Yeah.
How is that progressing?
Well, that the folks now there, many of them have gotten their own legal counsel to hold the railroad accountable, to hold the federal government accountable. Many of the additional health analyses have now been done. Of course, there's longitudinal studies that will be continued for a number of years. And then We also found that some of the workers who were the first who were there on the ground have also said that they've had a number of public health impacts and challenges, not so different than what we saw after 9/11 with folks who went into the Twin Towers, or, after the Twin Towers fell, and were part of the cleanup crews that were there. So I'm not saying that it is definitive yet of what the exposures were for folks who went in as a part of the emergency response teams. But there are all these different dynamics that are currently going on. But Rev, we would be disingenuous if we did not also bring into the conversation, as we're talking about East Palestine, Ohio, the fact that there are Black and brown communities who have been breathing in the exact same set of toxic chemicals for decades upon decades, and who had a difficult time in ever getting any attention. So with that being said, I want to see everybody made whole. I want to see all communities heal. But I also want to make sure that folks are very aware that communities who have been calling out for help for decades, we're not receiving the attention that was necessary.
Yes, and on top of that, I was talking with Juan and Anna Paras, from that great with that great organization Tejas in Texas, and they told me that the toxic soil that they're removing from the spill, they're taking that to a brown community in Texas because that's where they store that stuff, So it's like, yeah, you're cleaning up in one area, but now you're going to expose more Black and brown people to toxins and pollutants that have already made people sick, and we have no idea about how long those impacts will take, And the other thing is, I've heard some talk about how when President Obama was in office, and maybe you can bring clarity to this, that there were some regulations put in place that would make the railroad industry put in updated and better braking systems, but that when President Trump entered office, that he rolled some of those things back. And folks are wondering, is that the reason why for this train derailment and several others that we have? You have any information on that?
Well, you kind of covered it right there. So the answer is yes. President Obama tried to move forward on 21st century braking systems and sort of upgrading what was happening in that space. President Trump decided that it would cost too much. When you actually look with how much it was going to cost, it was just a tiny percentage. But that goes back to, do we value people's lives who live along these railroad tracks? We know we got 25 million people who live in blast zones along railroad tracks. And what that means is that when you take a look at all of the tracks that run across our country, and I think there's I forget what the number is, I may get this wrong, so blame it to my head and not my heart, 160,000 plus miles of railroad track. I think I have that number off, but they did an analysis and they found that if there were these explosions, who and how many people would be in these blast zones? And that's the number that they came up with. So that's information that both President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden all have access to, along with a lot of other folks. So it's about that cost benefit analysis that unfortunately people often do, and people's lives often end up on the lower priority side of the policy decisions that are made. So now we have a new administration that has the opportunity to make sure that what's going on in relationship to our railways, that there's stronger rules and regulations that are in place. And here's why we have to move forward on this. For those who've lived on the East Coast, and you've seen that on the days when the temperature gets hot, how Amtrak has a lot of difficulty. So Amtrak's not the only place that when temperatures get hot, that the railroad or the railways begin to deal with some really significant things, along with the flooding that we know continues to happen. Back home in Appalachia and West Virginia, we saw right after what happened in East Palestine, we saw a train derailment that was in the national park there and fell into the river. We saw in Detroit, we saw in another part of Ohio, right after East Palestine happened, these train derailments. There are over 1,500 derailments that happen on an annual basis. So we know that folks are carrying about 6 to 8% of their cargo is toxic pollution. So we know that this is going to happen again and again if we don't make sure that we have 21st century railways. And that means investments have to happen. And that means that the folks who own these companies, you know, are going to have to do better, or they're going to have to carry the costs for the damage that's done.
As we run down in time, so I've got a question, and it's kind of like a scenario for me. I grew up in Columbia, South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up across from a major gas and oil corporations storage tanks.
Yep.
That were across the street from me. Three major storage tanks that drained off into a swamp next to the tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how the people who are living in these environments today access the information and the people that they need to get the process started to deal with having to be in those particular situations. I know in Spartanburg, you talked about the situation in Spartanburg, and he actually worked for me for a couple of years in Spartanburg, so I know him well. But the reality of it basically is that ignorance is bliss in this particular area. We have bad groundwater in South Carolina. We have my brother was telling me, we were talking about that situation. He said, well, you know, one of our friends fell into that cesspool next to that particular facility. And the next day, his underwear was stuck to him.
Mm.
And he had sores all over his body. And I'm sure that's happening across America. How do we enlighten our community on how to deal with those issues?
I think the first part of it is things that you've been focused on your whole life. I know Reverend Woodbury has as well. It's really about education, but it's not about the education. You know, people want to have these deep science conversations that don't resonate with everyday folks. You know, they're trying to put food on the table, keep the lights on,
right,
those types of things. So what I do is, you know, we got 350,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution every year. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from gun violence. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from car crashes. More people are dying from air pollution than are dying from overdoses of drugs. And it is Black and brown and indigenous folks who are disproportionately in those numbers. So you have to bring it home for folks. So people will ask the question, you know, I grow my own food. And, you know, I stay active, but I still got cancer, or I still got heart disease, or I still got a liver or kidney disease or diabetes. And they don't realize that these toxins that they're also breathing in and drinking, now the science is showing the connections that are there, but people never hear about that. When you go to the doctor, he doesn't ask you the question of what you've been exposed to. So we've got to begin to make sure that we have ambassadors from our communities who are making the linkages of at least giving people the basic information and saying, maybe you need to ask about this because there are these new studies. The reason that we have Black maternal health and why are we having these miscarriages in our communities and why babies are being lost early and being, you know, underweight and all these types of things. We've got studies now that show the connection between the things people are breathing, the things people are drinking. The reason that we have dementia at the levels that we do now, and Alzheimer's and a number of these other things that are part of our brains and our neurological system is because of air pollution. There are a number of studies that keep coming out saying, hey, pay attention to this. So for me, if I'm sitting in the barbershop, you know, I ain't get my hair cut, but or if you're in the beauty salon, we've got to be able to share these basic things that resonate with folks that you just want folks to say, if you can get people to say, then that means that they're starting to think about it. And then you can tie them in. We should be making sure, I've been trying for decades now to get the Department of Education to actually begin to one, create the curricula that's necessary or provide the dollars for the curricula to not only go into our schools, but for us to also find ways of getting the information into our churches and synagogues and mosques, into our barbershops and beauty salons, our civic organizations, so that we can have an empowered and educated community about these issues. And I guarantee you, people who maybe didn't vote before will vote. People will start to understand that I don't have to necessarily accept that mill or that other toxic facility, because there are other types of businesses we could have in our communities. But lots of times people are just like, I didn't know. And as you said, sometimes we don't want to know, because we're like, if I know, then I got to do something. And I got to force somebody to do something.
Well, I think the issue here is, in the African-American community, we celebrate a lot of things. We celebrate our hair, we celebrate our nails, we celebrate our culture, we celebrate everything. What's the one thing you never hear about us celebrating?
Our health.
Our health.
Yeah.
We never celebrate the most important thing to us is our health. Not our job, not the quality of our education, but if we don't have good health, all the other things go out the window. So the challenge is to, and I'm starting a new magazine here in South Carolina right now called Living Healthy. And the whole concept of that magazine is quarterly, is basically to talk about how we as a community need to learn to take our health as the first consideration, not when we have a health issue, not when we have a health concern, but let's take health as our first and primary consideration.
Yeah, no, I agree. If we could get our folks to understand how amazing they are and the fact that they deserve both their mind, body, and spirit to be protected, then we would change so many different dynamics. Because I know that many of those aspects, they tried to strip it out of us and to reintroduce it in a way that folks find value is just a part of the work that we still have to do.
Absolutely. And I know our time is getting short, and I don't want to be remiss. I don't want Colin or anyone of your colleagues saying to me, well, you never discussed the National Wildlife Federation and what they do and what they're about. So, and that's still a part of the other things that we talked about. So, Mustafa, why don't you tell folks about the National Wildlife Federation and some of the things that they do and the directions that they've been moving into, your organization's been moving into when it comes to environmental justice and racial equity, et cetera.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. Well, I think the best way for us to start that particular conversation is go back to the first principle of environmental justice. Many of your viewers will know there are 17 principles of environmental justice that came out of that 1991 first People of Color Summit. And the first one talks about honoring the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species. And we as a people have always been connected to Mother Nature. One of the reasons that we were brought to this country is because our expertise around agriculture, along with our free labor. So I when I think about the National Wildlife Federation, and it's about protecting both wildlife and public, or, natural spaces and also people. That first principle of environmental justice, it has to be a bedrock of the work that is there. It is a framework, if you will, along with the other 16 principles. So, the National Wildlife Federation, as you mentioned, one of the largest nonprofits in the country, was founded on a conservation sort of platform, if you will. And we all know it's really interesting when you look at conservation, because we were doing conservation for millennia, people of color. So I always remind folks of that. Of course, some of the early conservationists were racist. They were not folks who were interested in Black and Brown and Indigenous folks being able to access, the beauty, the natural spaces brings to us, and all the healing that exists in that space. When I first came, there were 0 people of color in senior leadership, and now 50% of our senior leadership is now folks of color. We're moving into our new strategic planning process, and environmental justice and equity are two of the pillars of the work that we do. Why is that important? You know, we have a huge reach in education. We reach between 10 and 14 million students every year through a number of different educational initiatives that we are part of. We play a very big role in Capitol Hill and in state houses around policy. So we make sure that environmental justice and climate justice is built into the policies that we advocate for. We know that the climate crisis, the hurricanes and the floods and the wildfires are directly tied to the outdoors, and making sure that we're building into the sets of actions around revitalizing, shorelines, and making sure that cover crops are not just for certain farmers, but for all farmers, and making sure that Black farmers now can take advantage of these new sets of economic opportunities that are in that space. When we see the deforestation that's going on, we know that as Black and brown folks who have been protecting our forests and our jungles and our wetlands for millennia. So we make sure that that's being honored in the space as well. So there are a number of amazing things that the National Wildlife Federation can do. You all know Colin O'Mare is a young president. When he first talked to me about joining, he said he wanted to create a 21st century organization. And I said, do you know what that means? He said, I think so. And I said, environmental justice and equity have to be, a central point of the work that we do. And we began that journey together.
And I think that's amazing, especially in I'm not going to say anything that people can't find out themselves because it's public information, but it's amazing that a nonprofit, a major nonprofit organization with a budget of about $100 million sees the importance of moving in these directions. But then what's also disconcerting is looking at local government and others who don't see the need for change. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about those who we put in office out of love. But you campaigned and you ran on a platform that was built on the fact that people wanted change, and you promised them directly or indirectly. And then we tend to get people in office who, once they get there, they become defensive. It's like, oh, if you attack the local government or the state, you're attacking me. And not realizing that true change, progress, and justice only comes about when people, especially policymakers, are willing to push the envelope, not stay contained in what we're doing, what we've always done, what we're doing now, but pushing the envelope in new directions. And I personally want to thank you for helping to lead that effort at the National Wildlife Federation, and hope that it's an example not only for other nonprofits, but for people in for-profit businesses, and also for people who sit in elected offices, from Washington, D.C. to Columbia in South Carolina, and to our local governments as well. And how do you guys, I know you deal a lot in D.C., but how are you going to get that message out? Because all politics is local.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens locally also impacts what happens nationally, right?
That's so true. Yeah, in the environmental justice movement, we say communities speak for themselves, and that's because they have the expertise and the knowledge about what's happening, whether it's in their hoods or their barrios or their trailer parks or wherever it may be, their communities. And the way that it's done is, we have regional offices, we also have affiliates, and then of course we also have authentic partners. So it is about, one, making sure that they have the information and tools that they need on their journey, and making sure that then they have the resources that they need to be able to do the work that they know how to do so well. And then advocating for these larger pots of money, for the significant percentage of those to actually go to those who are doing the work on the ground. That's the paradigm that we operate from. It is not about our organization getting the resources. We find ourselves being a conduit to opening the doors or to making sure that we can help folks around capacity as they are framing out the direction that they see fit. And it is also hopefully about building a stronger family, whether you want to call it a conservation family or environmental justice or climate justice family, for the challenges that we have in front of us. This climate crisis, the climate emergency we find ourselves in is no joke. And it is literally going to take all of us to be able, to navigate it and hopefully get on top of what's happening. We saw and we know what's happened in Princeville, North Carolina twice now, the flooding that's gone through there, the flooding there in South Carolina as an example. We know forest fires don't just happen out west, they also happen in North Carolina, South Carolina, parts of Georgia. We know that these extreme heat events that go on, that Black folks are twice as likely to die in extreme heat situations than our white brothers and sisters. But everybody, you remember the quote from Dr. King when he said, we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. We were literally in this boat together. Of course, some of the boats ain't got no oars. Some of the boats got some holes in them. So we got to kind of shore those as we rowing. But, these sets of challenges that are in front of us are going to impact everyone. Sometimes wealthy communities are like, well, that's that thing that's going to happen over there on the other side of the tracks. It don't work that way. Yeah, our communities get hit first and worst, but we're talking about a set of situations that will impact everyone, or we can get our act together. We can do the right things. We can actually uplift each other, and we can make sure that we are creating a new economy, that no one gets left behind, and that we finally begin to address the isms and the ills of the past, whether it's racism or sexism or ageism. We got to leave all that. We got to get rid of that, the impacts that are happening there, and begin to move toward this North Star, which is justice.
Oh man, awesome closing, and we're about out of time. I think we have time, Larry. If you have like 1 or 2 minutes, a comment or a quick question before we close out, because I can feel you just itching to ask something or say something.
I think you did very informative. I think we just need to figure out how to all get on the same page process and make sure that all of us are working for the same goal, which is positive life. Like I said, Third Rock, it might outside of town in this point, in this stage, but eventually it's going to affect the whole planet, and that's where the challenge comes.
Thank you, Larry. And so as we prepare to close, as always, we want people to know how they can get in touch with our guests or with myself and Larry, who are your hosts. And so, Mustafa, you want to tell folks how they can get in touch with you and or the National Wildlife Federation?
Yeah, if you want to reach out to the National Wildlife Federation, it's really easy. It's nwf.org, www.nwf.org. And if you want to reach me, it's mustafasantiagoali.com. And that will take you to learn a little bit more about the various sets of work that I do, both on the environment, climate, gun violence, and revitalizing vulnerable communities.
Yes. And Larry, how can they reach you? You can reach me through our website, which is www.scvillage-voices.com. That's our website. And you can also reach me at 813-667-1818. That's the community tax inspector. Thank you. And if you want to reach us, New Alpha Community Development Corporation, you can go to our website, www.newalphacdc.com, or email us at info@newalphacdc.com, or call us at the church where I am blessed the pastor, Kingdom Living Temple. That's where I am a lot of time. And you can call us there at 843-799-1111.
0740. And so to our guest, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, I don't have to tell you, we talk to each other all of the time. We have to continue to work, continue your good work, because the alternative is not acceptable in any conceivable way. So thank you so much for joining us. And for all of you out there, if you want to know the things you need to know, and if you want to know the places where we should go, then join us next week at this time, once again, for the Leo and Larry Show. Thank you all. Stay blessed.